left behind the comfort of home to join a war that wasn't his and to stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukrainians on the front line. Today with us is Matthew Sampson, a former U.S. Marine Corps Scout sniper who served in Iraq and Afghanistan and later volunteered to fight for Ukraine as a part of the International Legion. Matthew, welcome to our program.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here.
Today, Kyiv once again woke up to the sounds of air alert and explosions. And for Ukrainians, this has become a part of everyday life. How do you, as someone who has seen war up so close, experience this missiles attack today?
For me, I see it as very similar to the way that your average Ukrainian sees it, as just another part of daily life, and it's almost rare when it's not happening. My first few days in Kyiv, it was very quiet, and I was very surprised that it was so quiet because I expected a lot more attacks to be happening. And that's something that I try to share with the Americans when I go back and spend time in the United States and help them understand, because unless they volunteer to go to a war zone, no Americans really alive today know what an air raid siren sounds like.
Matthew, you're probably one of the few Americans who spent so many days here in Ukraine and especially in battlefield. Can you tell us more? How long have you been here and what are your main responsibilities right now?
So I believe today is 736 days that I've spent in Ukraine since the full-scale invasion. This is my fourth trip here. My first trip here, I did 635 days consecutively before I left the country. And yes, I believe that put me at the very top of the list of the most amount of days consecutively to spend here as an American citizen that was not living here previously, that did not have any connection, that was doing combat operations and not just humanitarian operations. So when I was here then, I was a commander of a special operations teams at the front line with the Directorate of Intelligence of Ukraine. And I had a special ops team there, about half Ukrainian, half foreign. Out of the foreigners, mostly Americans, but I had maybe 20 or 30 different nationalities come and go off of my team, I think from every single continent except for Antarctica, including we even had a couple Russians on our team to show that this is really an issue from Putin and from the Kremlin more than it is just every single Russian wants to kill people over here. So it was eye-opening for me to interact with so many different nationalities from all over the world. People that were rich, people that were poor, people that had combat experience, people that were just civilians and wanted to leave their country and come here and fight. So it's been a big and new experience for me. Now, I feel I still fight the war and help Ukraine, but I'm fighting with my voice instead of my rifle. And so far, I think I've been more effective at fighting with my voice and sharing my experience, especially with the American people and the American lawmakers, to find how we can get a little bit closer to the end of the war and full sovereignty for the country of Ukraine.
I would like to go deep into your personal story and to understand what was the moment when you decided, I'm going to Ukraine.
I would say I remember the 24th of February of 2022. And the first time I saw anything going on, and really the first time I think I heard and actually paid attention to the word Ukraine, I was at the gym and I was just watching the Russian armored vehicles coming into Ukraine. And prior to that, again, really didn't know the word Ukraine really at all. And it was something that I felt would be over in maybe a couple weeks. And then I think it was a couple days later, I saw your president, President Zelensky, go on camera and formally invite anyone that wants to come and help and join an international legion. And that was, I think, the moment that I decided I wanted to come and help. I spent a couple months doing some research first, because at that time, myself, along with many others, believed the disinformation and the propaganda that the Russian army was the second strongest army in the world. So me being an individual, I'd be coming here by myself, I wanted to make sure that it made some amount of sense logically to face the second strongest military in the world. So thankfully, I got to connect with some Americans that were already here, folks that I had worked with previously in Baghdad, Iraq. I spent thousands of days in Iraq as a security contractor. And that helped me out a lot to better understand the reality and help me understand what I should pack, what I should bring, if I should bring my own body armor or if body armor would be provided, stuff like that. So it was May of 2022 that I finally left the United States to come over here. And I stayed until February of 2024 for my first time ever in the country of Ukraine.
What did your family and friends think when you decided to go here?
I'm very close with my sister. She's 20 years older than me. She's always supported me as a person and as her brother. She's not always excited about my career choice. I was in the United States Marine Corps for 5 years, active duty, and I did Iraq and Afghanistan combat deployments during that time. So she was always very proud of me and what I was doing, but always very excited when I'd be back in the United States and safe. So I know that she was not excited that I was going into a new war, especially a war considered the most intense fighting in all of Europe for almost 100 years. But very supportive nonetheless. A lot of my friends, they didn't really understand what was going on here. So again, they supported me as a person. I think one or two of my friends thought that I might be misunderstanding the situation a lot and not really understanding the Russian capabilities. So they're very concerned for me.
How easy or difficulties for you was to join the Ukrainian army, and how did Ukrainians treat you, more as an outsider or as a part of their team? And I would like also to know, maybe you had some problems, with the understanding of the language, some language barriers, mentality barriers.
Good question. So when I came over, I wasn't really sure exactly where I was going. I was told in an email that on the Ukrainian side of the fence of the border would be a tent that said International Legion, along with a lot of other tents for Red Cross and other NGOs that were helping. So I went there and really didn't have too many problems. I explained to them who I was. I told them very briefly what my background was. And they quickly sent me over to, over here they call it the GUR, the Directorate of Intelligence of Ukraine, because they have their own section of the International Legion. And that's who I was with for my entire time over here the first time. And most people don't know that there's multiple different parts of the International Legion. The biggest part, the most well-known part, has battalions, and they are directly under the Armed Forces of Ukraine, and they operate more like regular military. For me, my part was more intelligence gathering, so everything we were doing was more special operations. We still did a lot of combat operations, but it was really to maximize the amount of prisoners that we could take, maximize the amount of intelligence that we could gather that could also help other forces, within the area. So that meant that everyone that I was working with had some kind of specialty usually within their background, regardless of what type of military they came from. So that was something that was helpful for me. With it being international, the most common language was English. I'm very thankful for that. I speak 2 languages. I speak American and I speak freedom, and I really don't speak any other languages. And I'm good at a lot of things, but foreign languages is something I've never been good at. Over 2,000 days in Iraq, and I think I learned like 5 words in Arabic. It's just not something I'm good at, and I'm very thankful that I really had no problem speaking only English during my time over here, and that was something that just made the transition a little bit better. Initially, there was times that myself and other Westerners, especially Americans, were looked at both as outsiders and as great helpers, both at the same time. And part of it was justified, and part of it was just misunderstandings. So for us, the warfare here is very different than Iraq and Afghanistan. And I can go into more detail with that if you like. But that was something that myself and just about anyone else that came from a NATO country or the United States military, we had to make some pretty good adjustments just within ourselves to be able to better work with the Ukrainian military folks, because Ukrainian military just does things differently than what we do. And some of it's better, some of it's worse, and some of it's just different because it's completely different warfare.
You fought on different fronts, Zaporizhia, and I know that you was even in Bakhmut. What was the hardest for you, the physical challenges or the emotional ones, including moments of fear, if you had it?
Yes, I fought in a lot of different areas. Zaporizhia region, Kharkiv region, Mykolaiv region, and Donetsk, primarily in Bakhmut. I think almost all of 2023 was spent in Bakhmut. Some of the shrapnel that I brought here with me is shrapnel from Bakhmut of Russian artillery. This is actually a piece here that hit me just outside of Bakhmut, and thankfully it went through a lot of trees and bushes before it hit me, and thankfully it didn't really injure me, but that was a rather close call, and that was one of the times that I was almost completely vaporized, was in Bakhmut. But I have to say that the fighting in Bakhmut was a lot of fun. And that was just because of how quickly we had to adapt our tactics and how we had to really focus on working with adjacent forces, whether it was Chechens, other people within the International Legion, or Ukrainian armed forces. So that was something that was very beneficial. I would say for some of the more difficult stuff, probably in the Zaporizhia region, and trying to get more support amongst other forces within the Ukrainian military to help us get across the river. Almost every operation that we did in Zaporizhia included us going across the river, whether the Dnipro or smaller rivers. And that was really probably the biggest challenge of just the coordination of how to get so many fighters across the river quick enough that we all don't just get killed in the process.
You already mentioned that this war is different, and Ukrainians, the way Ukrainians are fighting is also different. And today in media, we see that many Western allies, many Western leaders say that they are learning from the Russian war against Ukraine. And from your perspective, from your experience, what kind of lessons could the West take away?
I know that one of the first big ones that I learned that was different was trench warfare. In Iraq and Afghanistan, there are no trenches. Every once in a while, we come across caves and we had to go and do combat operations in caves, but that is extremely rare. So that was something that we don't train for trenches at all in the American military. The closest that comes to that is hallways, but usually hallways have doors. And so it's just very, very different of the trench warfare aspect and how to go about that in the best way possible to not get killed in the process. So that was an adjustment. I know that one of the days that we had the most amount of arguments between the Westerners and the Ukrainians was the proper way to go into a room, trying to clear a building that might be held by Russians. And we found that it was just different ways, and the Ukrainian way made more sense just because the battlefield is different. And we know that the Russians booby-trap things a lot more than what we're used to in Iraq and Afghanistan. So in Iraq and Afghanistan, we were much more used to clearing a room with as many people as possible. If you can put 7 people in that room and there's room, then we'll do something like that. Whereas here in Ukraine, it's the exact opposite, because they know that almost everything inside the room could be attached to an explosive. So that was a bit of a challenge to be able to make that adjustment, and also not always having as many assets on the battlefield that we're used to, especially for the United States. In the U.S., we have usually a lot of assets on the battlefield, and that's something that generally doesn't exist here because so much of the battlefield is equal at times, and that's not something that we're really used to.
Ukraine has been made great progress with producing its own long-range missiles. We know the recent example is Flamingo, and also is producing a lot of drones. How capable do you think Ukrainian army is today?
Very much so. And since my time here in 2022 to now, and I was just at the front lines a few days ago talking to battlefield commanders that I know and trust, and folks that I've known for over 3 years now. And I've been able to see a huge improvement between the military tactics of 2022 and today. And that's something that I am very surprised and proud of. That making mistakes in war usually means a bunch of people on your side get killed. and that can be a big problem. And the Ukrainian military still has a lot of improvements to make, just like any military does. But for me, it's been really cool to see how quickly they've adapted. And I'm confident that a big part of that is how much NATO is helping, both NATO countries and the U.S. They have a very strong and tight partnership with the Ukrainian military, and also within the Foreign Legion that works for the intelligence community. And I know that that's helping out a lot. And that's one of the reasons why the Ukrainian military is so much more effective than the Russian military. The Russians, they learn from their mistakes also, a little bit slower in my experience than the Ukrainians, but they don't have such a positive influence like what we have here with the NATO countries helping out with resources. And also I know that some of these other countries are helping Ukraine with the development of some of their own weapons.
In the beginning of our conversation, you said that in the beginning of the full-scale war, you thought that Russian army is the second army in the world. Did you change your thoughts after going to Ukraine?
I would say that I was probably here maybe less than a month before I realized that was some propaganda that a lot of the world, myself included, believed, and that was completely wrong, and that there was no evidence to support it. There's so much corruption over there in the Russian military that is why their military is so weak. It was weak 3 years ago, it was weak 4 years ago, and it's very weak even today, even with all the fighting they're doing and everything that they send over here. Still incredibly weak because no accountability within their forces and very little discipline and so much corruption that any normal military commander knows if you invade a country, you put new tires on your vehicle. When we invaded Iraq from Kuwait, it was before I joined the military. I was still in high school. But I know it wasn't with stuff that was just falling apart. But that was something that the Russian commanders thought would be a good idea because they were able to put more money in their pocket and defraud their own government, which got a lot of their own people killed. So that's a huge difference that I see between the two.
And at the same time, some intelligence reports that Russia could strike European states in the coming years, and there is kind of a deadline, as they say, in 2030. Do you think the West is prepared for a possible conflict with Russia?
I think every day that this goes on, they are getting more and more prepared. I know that the United States has strongly encouraged European nations to spend more money on their own defense to help deal with situations like what we're dealing with today. And the amount of land that Russia has taken here in Ukraine has, I think, been a huge and very good wake-up call for a lot of the European Union nations that they really need to take Russia more seriously than they actually have. So I'm very grateful that my country is strongly encouraging, sometimes forcefully, that the European countries spend more money on their defense to help avoid stuff like this from happening. We're all very confident that if the countries over here had much stronger militaries years ago, that most likely Putin never would have launched a full-scale invasion. He only did this because he thought he would win easily.
This week you are going to Washington to speak to Congress again and advocating for more support for Ukraine. Do you feel this topic is still on the agenda and still a priority in the US?
I believe it is. Yes, when I go to Washington, I go there for the Ukraine Action Summit. This happens twice a year. I believe this one is number 7 that happens. And I work with the American Coalition for Ukraine, and it's made up of hundreds and hundreds of people from all over the country. So the one I did most recently was in April of this year. There was over 600 people there representing all 50 states and the territory of Puerto Rico, all for delegates to speak to their respective congressmen and women. And it was a lot of good people there. Some folks there don't like me very much, but a lot of them have been extremely supportive of what's going on here. Some of them also may not do a whole lot of fighting over here, but they come here doing humanitarian stuff, delivering aid, delivering sometimes protective equipment like body armor or just tourniquets, stuff like that. So it's not just made up of people that are just sitting at home in America all the time, but people that they've come here a lot more often than I have. Again, this is only my 4th time here, and some of them come over here almost once a month for maybe a few days or a week at a time to bring as many supplies as they could fit into a suitcase. So during this summit in Washington, yes, we will be talking to all the representatives of our states. So I'm one of the delegates from Arizona. So I'll be talking directly to all of those offices. And that's something that I feel is very helpful for what's going on, because there's very few Americans that have spent any significant amount of time over here, especially doing combat operations. That's also a former veteran of other wars within the United States. So far I have received very good receptions from the offices that I've talked to, that they're able to hear from a fellow American that's a veteran that also served, our country, the United States, in war, to hear my perspective of what's going on here, to best target the most efficient support possible. And that even includes us advocating for Congress to put more pressure on Russia to return the almost 20,000 confirmed children that we know that have been kidnapped from occupied areas. We know that number is much, much larger. Russia says it's over 700,000 children, so 20,000 isn't really an accurate number, but it's a confirmed number. So that's something that we will be advocating for again next week, is more pressure put on Russia to return the children. And that's something that's nice, that whether it's a Republican office or a Democrat office, no one argues about children should not be part of warfare. And that's something that we might argue about some of the other specifics of how to support Ukraine. But keeping the children out of it and trying to get children home is something that every office fully agrees with, and it's nice to see that support.
Could you also tell us more, when did you start your advocacy work, and how do you feel the atmosphere in the community around this topic in the US?
So I left Ukraine the first time in February of 2024. And I did a little bit of sharing my experience as soon as I landed in the United States. There was a City Hall rally going on to honor the 2nd anniversary of this invasion. And I got to meet some folks in Texas. And my first time doing full advocacy work would have been April of 2024. And that's when I was invited by the American Coalition for Ukraine to come to DC and be a representative and a subject matter expert of the frontline operations from the American warfighter perspective, because they really didn't have anyone at all that spent so many hundreds of days over here fighting. They had some other folks that might have spent, a few months here and there or something like that, but no one that spent over 600 days without any break over here doing combat operations. So overall, it was good. The times that I had issues were when the person I was talking to, and this includes Ukrainian refugees that have been in the United States for maybe, the last 3 years, the last couple of years. Ukrainian Americans that have been in the United States maybe for decades, and sometimes just Americans that understand that Russia is our enemy. So it's a wide range of people all over the country in all different walks of life. And the only time I really had issues is when they heard the word Republican. I am a registered Republican. I don't really go around telling people that they should vote for my party or not. I really don't care who you vote for. One reason that my country is better than other countries is you're strongly encouraged to vote for whoever you want to, and that's done privately, yourself in a box on a piece of paper, or however your state handles the voting process. But when they hear that I'm a Republican, some of them have told me that I should go and kill myself because Republicans should not be allowed to live. And that shows me how effective the propaganda and disinformation is coming out of the Kremlin. Because some of these people are, from areas of Ukraine that I've been in trenches in, fighting for their country. And I also see it fighting for my own country as well, because Russia is America's #1 enemy and has been for a very long time. But the word Republican has put me, I think, in more danger in the United States than any danger that I faced at the front lines. And that's something that seems to be getting worse. I'm trying my best to continue a nonviolent and peaceful dialogue with all the folks that I work with, regardless of who we might vote for and whether or not we like the current administration or not, and try to have the stance of human life has higher value than whether or not we agree with each other. And that includes even the enemy. From a Western standpoint, and as an American, legally, morally, and ethically, we are required, and deep down, we treat even the enemy with basic human respect. That if they decide they want to surrender and they're injured, then we're obligated to do everything we can reasonably to keep them alive and to render aid to them. And that's something that doesn't happen in a lot of other countries at all. We know that when Russians capture Ukrainians, that's not how they treat the Ukrainians. We know, it's on video, a lot of places on the internet of Ukrainians just being executed. Civilians, soldiers that have surrendered, that are willing to be taken prisoner, are just executed because Russia doesn't have that value of life. But deep down at our core as Americans, that is something that we hold dear. And it is something that I find common with the Ukrainian military as well. We notice that the more prisoners that we take and keep alive, that's more Ukrainians that get to come home during prisoner exchange. So it's been a wide range of my experience in the U.S. of people that are very supportive. Some will be supportive for weeks until they hear the word Republican, and then all of a sudden they get very disrespectful, or again, they'll tell me that I need to go kill myself. One refugee told me that all Americans that fight for Ukraine, especially if they're Republicans, should be put in camps and then eliminated because they shouldn't be allowed to talk because they have nothing important to say because no Republicans do. But again, that shows how effective the Kremlin is at creating new enemies within the United States. So what that does is these folks see other Americans as the enemy instead of focusing on Russia being the enemy, and that's a big problem. And unfortunately, Russia's just really good at this, and it's something that I know that there's definitely folks in the U.S., myself included, that are working very hard to combat this propaganda that's targeting our country.
Indeed, and even here in Ukraine, we have some doubts about Trump's administration, because I think that, of course, Ukrainians want to see the full support from the US, and especially some long-range missiles that we needed. Yeah. And actually, I want even to talk about this topic because you know that in recent days, last week, the media was bombing with the headlines about Tomahawk missiles, but at the end, after the meeting with Zelensky and Trump, nothing unfortunately happened for Ukraine. And as for the American, as for the Republican, I would like to hear your opinion. How do you feel about the idea of delivering these Tomahawk missiles for Ukraine?
I know that, first, Ukraine does have some long-range capabilities already. So in that specific context, Tomahawks are not necessary. We saw earlier this year, they called it Operation Spiderweb, a very long-range operation that took 1.5 years of planning and extreme secrecy, which I'm very proud of the Ukrainian community of keeping that secret, to destroy a huge amount of Russian nuclear bombers and stuff like that. So the capability is here already, and capability has been here for quite some time. Something like a Tomahawk, it does have a very specific role, and it's very good at what it does. And in that context, I could say from being on the battlefield, it isn't 100% necessary to have an additional long-range weapon, but it could definitely be helpful, absolutely. And I agree that it could be helpful with the right targets. So that's really good. I saw a headline just recently that I think it was the new Secretary of Defense, or now Secretary of War, that was just leaving, having meetings in the European Union to strongly encourage more European Union members to spend more money to get more support for Ukraine. That was a headline that quickly disappeared. Not like it was taken off the internet, but I saw it just for a moment, and I didn't see too many people reporting about it. I feel like that's probably the Kremlin at work pretty well. From my perspective, I don't personally know anyone that's high up in the administration. I've never been to the White House. I've never talked to our president ever. I've never talked to any of the secretaries ever directly. I've seen some of the past secretaries when I was in Baghdad, Iraq as a security contractor years ago. So I don't really know what's going on behind closed doors. And that includes when President Zelensky and the American president, President Trump, or even in the past, President Biden, when they're having meetings behind closed doors, none of us knows what's going on in those meetings. But I find great encouragement that those meetings are happening. I know that important meetings are not held in front of a camera. Important meetings do not have a camera in the room. Important meetings usually don't have 30 or 50 people in the room. Very important meetings usually have very few people in the room, and there's usually no public record of what is talked about in that meeting. So the fact that those private meetings are happening, that is very, very encouraging, because I feel that if the United States was officially not going to help Ukraine, there's no reason to have a private meeting behind closed doors. And I know that recently, I think it was almost split in half of the meeting with Zelensky and Trump was very public with cameras and a lot of people in the room, and half the meeting was not public at all. So that's very encouraging for us. So that's pretty huge. And I know that aside from what's being talked about, I could definitely talk about evidence on the ground. I have physically held and used weapons at the front lines that came under Trump's first administration. And I even saw paperwork from the Ukrainian government showing when it came into the country, it was well within Trump's presidency that these came in. And that was a huge part of the weapons that were used on day one of this invasion and the first week of this invasion. And then after that, a lot of weapons started coming in from the Biden administration that helped. As a warfighter, in my perspective, it's better to have a small amount of weapons before escalation in war, before it gets worse. That's more effective than getting a lot of weapons after it gets worse. So the fact that weapons were here already shows that there was some amount of physical, tangible evidence that the United States government was actively supporting Ukraine against Russia. And I think the only reason we're able to talk right now in Kyiv is because those weapons were here and they were able to keep the Russians from completely capturing Kyiv, because they got pretty close.
President Donald Trump wants to achieve a ceasefire in Ukraine, and meanwhile, Russian dictator refuses to back down and seeks full occupation of the country. And we see his tactics and bombing citizens and just basically peace cities. From your perspective as a soldier, as a military, what do you think needs to happen for Ukraine to secure long and lasting peace?
More support for Ukraine. That's really the short answer. And more support from Ukraine, not just from the United States, but from all NATO forces, or I should say NATO countries. That there's an aspect of the Russian government that we have seen evidence of, that they have some amount of logical intelligence here. And whether you support them or not, when President Biden came to Kyiv, the United States government notified the Kremlin and the Russian government that the U.S. president would be coming into Kyiv. And Kyiv was quiet that day. Ukraine was quiet that day. There was fighting on the front lines. There was no cruise missiles that day. So it showed that there was a massive amount of respect for the President of the United States, that if a cruise missile came into Kyiv that day, this war could have changed in an instant. So I believe that with especially America's partnership with Ukraine and more European countries getting more directly involved with more support, ammunition, weapons, equipment, humanitarian aid, medical aid. Medical is something that's always needed in war. When I was at the front lines just recently, the only thing the soldiers wanted, they didn't ask for food, they didn't ask for water, they just asked for more ammunition so they could shoot the weapons more. And they're using, I made a short video while I was there, they were using an American artillery piece. And I don't know about that specific gun, but that artillery piece was originally designed during World War II. And that design is almost 100 years old, and it's still out there fighting our enemies for us. But more support from as many countries as possible that really take sovereignty and freedom seriously.
Matthew, thank you for your position, for your stance, and for this conversation.
Absolutely. I'm really happy to be able to share. And also, one of the ways that people can kind of follow what I'm doing, it's pretty easy to find me now. If you Google Matthew Sampson Ukraine, I'm the entire Google page. The first thing that pops up is my website, and all my personal contact information is on there: WhatsApp, Telegram, Signal, Facebook, email. I think that's one of the ways that you and I got connected. And so I strongly encourage that if anyone is interested in what's going on, hearing my perspective, whether they agree with me or not, is encouraged to get involved. And I also have fundraisers on there if they want to help out with what's going on. And it's something that I'm very passionate about. I came here to help protect a nation of people against an enemy that there's evil there. Very similar to fighting the Nazis in the 30s and 40s, that this isn't just a difference of ideas, this is good versus evil.
Thank you.
Thank you.